Chapter 11 of Mapping the Human Mind. The Crusades, Faith as a Weapon, the Evolution of Holy War. The cracks that widened in the Great Schism had done more than divide East and West. They revealed how malleable belief could be, how authority, power and doctrine might be shaped to suit the needs of the moment. And nowhere was this malleability more evident than in the Crusades. How did the religion founded by a man who preached, "Love your enemies," transform into one that promised salvation for killing them? This remarkable evolution spanned centuries, a fascinating case study in how theological principles adapt to political realities. Early Christianity exhibited clear pacifistic tendencies. For the first 3 centuries after Christ, Christian writers consistently rejected military service and violence. Origen, a theologian from Alexandria, wrote that we no longer take up sword against nation, nor do we learn war anymore. Having become sons of peace through Jesus, we do indeed by our prayers destroy all demons which stir up wars, violate oaths, and disturb the peace. Tertullian asked, "Shall it be held lawful to make a profession of the sword, when the Lord proclaims that he who uses the sword shall perish by the sword?" Such pacifism made perfect sense for a marginalised religious minority. But as Christianity gained political power after Constantine's conversion, it faced new questions. How does a Christian empire defend itself? What happens when turning the other cheek means leaving your people vulnerable to invasion? Enter St. Augustine, whose concept of just war would forever change Christianity's relationship with violence. Writing as the Roman Empire crumbled around him, Augustine proposed that violence could be justified under specific conditions: legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. Not an endorsement, but a reckoning. Violence, he argued, could be morally navigated under strict conditions. For centuries after Augustine, Christian thought held firm. While war might be politically necessary, it remained spiritually troubling. Even in a just cause, soldiers were expected to seek penance, and violence was never morally neutral. It was a burden to the soul, not a path to grace. So what changed? How did we get from Augustine's reluctant justification to Urban II's promise that crusading would substitute for all penance for sin? The transformation came through a series of conceptual steps that gradually fused spiritual merit with military action. First, the concept of defensive war expanded. Initially limited to immediate self-defense, it gradually stretched to include preemptive actions and protection of distant Christian communities. The Byzantine Emperor's appeal for help against Turkish advances became framed as a defence of Christianity itself. Second, pilgrimage gained new spiritual significance. By the 11th century, the journey to Jerusalem had become a form of penance that could reduce time in purgatory. When the Seljuk Turks restricted access to Jerusalem, they created an obstacle to salvation itself. Finally, the Church developed a more elaborate understanding of penance, sin, and redemption. If certain actions could reduce spiritual punishment, why not include defending the Church through military service? These threads converged in 1095 in the Council of Clermont, where Pope Urban II delivered a speech that would launch the First Crusade. The precise wording is lost to history, but its impact was unmistakable. Urban framed the campaign to recapture Jerusalem not just as politically desirable, but as spiritually transformative. Undertake this journey for the remission of your sins and the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. The gathering at Clermont was unlike anything the small French town had ever seen. Thousands packed in the fields outside the cathedral, nobles in their finery, commoners in their rough wool, monks in their habits. When Urban II appeared, resplendent in papal regalia, a hush fell over the crowd. His voice carried across the field as he described Jerusalem in chains, of Christian pilgrims harassed, of the Byzantine Empire besieged by a race wholly alienated from God. But it was his final promise that made history. Those that took up the cross would have their sins forgiven. In that moment, as the crowd erupted to cries of Deus Vult, God wills it, the crusading ideal was born, and with it a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to follow Christ. With Urban's words, a new concept was born. War was no longer just justified, it was sanctified. Violence was no longer something requiring penance, it was penance itself. The cross, once a symbol of Christ's sacrifice and suffering, would now adorn the shields of those dealing death in his name. This theological innovation solved immediate political problems. It motivated thousands to undertake the dangerous journey to the Holy Land, but it created profound philosophical tensions that Christianity still grapples with today. The transformation from a faith of martyrs willing to die for their beliefs to one of warriors willing to kill for them represented a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to follow Christ. Theological innovations. The concept of holy war required more than just rhetorical justification. It needed practical mechanisms to transform theory into action. The Church developed several institutional innovations that made the Crusades possible. The concept of indulgences, remission of temporal punishment for sins, expanded dramatically. Originally granted for acts of charity or pilgrimage, indulgences became associated with military service in holy wars. This created a spiritual economy where violence, properly directed, could reduce one's time in purgatory. The creation of military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers institutionalized the concept of warrior monks. These organizations resolved the tension between monastic piety and military service by combining both into a new vocation. Their rule allowed them to follow monastic disciplines while simultaneously training for and engaging in warfare. New rituals emerged to sacralize warfare. The blessing of weapons, the taking of the cross, special masses for crusaders, all created a liturgical framework that integrated warfare into Christian religious practice. The warrior's sword evolved from a mere tool into a sacred instrument. A holy war gone rogue. The Crusades were intended to be the ultimate expression of Christian unity, a collective mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, yet by 1204, the Fourth Crusade veered dramatically off course. Instead of marching towards Jerusalem, the Crusaders found themselves besieging Constantinople, a fellow Christian city, and then they sacked it. The supposed defenders of the faith turned their swords on their own. This catastrophic detour stemmed from Venetian greed and political manipulation. The Crusaders, deeply in debt and desperate, cut a deal with Venice to pay off their obligations by looting the wealth of Constantinople. The consequences were devastating. A city that had stood as the shining jewel of Eastern Christianity was ransacked, its churches desecrated, and its people slaughtered by the very knights who claimed to fight for Christ. The sack of Constantinople marked more than a military catastrophe. It shattered the illusion of Christian unity. The East and West, already separated since the Great Schism, became adversaries in spirit as well as in politics. With the city's fall, any lingering hope of reconciliation crumbled. Both the walls and the very idea of a unified Christendom collapsed. The cognitive construction of the other. The Crusades transformed not only geography and politics, but also how people thought. The need to mobilise thousands of Europeans to fight in distant lands required creating powerful mental frameworks that would override natural hesitations about killing fellow humans. The process began with simplification. Muslim societies spanning from Spain to India, encompassing diverse ethnic groups, languages, and theological traditions were reduced to a singular entity, the Saracen or the infidel. This cognitive compression made a complex reality manageable by erasing nuance and individuality. Dehumanization followed. Crusade propagandists portrayed Muslims not just as religiously mistaken, but as fundamentally different from Europeans, either bestial in nature or demonically influenced. Pope Urban II's call to crusade described Muslims as a race utterly alienated from God, estranged from the truth, and a generation that has not directed its heart and has not entrusted its spirit to God. Medieval art depicted Muslims with exaggerated or monstrous features, placing them somewhere between human and beast. The final step was moral inversion, where actions normally considered sinful, killing, looting, destruction, became virtuous when directed at this constructed other. Bernard of Clairvaux revealed this cognitive dissonance when he wrote that killing Muslims was not homicide but malicide, the killing of evil itself. Once established, this mental template could be transferred to new targets. The same frameworks used to justify violence against Muslims was later applied to Jews and even Eastern Christians. The attack on Constantinople demonstrated how thoroughly this cognitive rewiring had taken hold. Once trained to see religious others as legitimate targets for violence, Crusaders could redirect that violence even towards those with whom they shared fundamental beliefs. Beyond Jerusalem, the idea of holy war, once unleashed, proved difficult to contain. While Jerusalem dominated the popular imagination, the Church expanded the crusading concept to address threats closer to home, reshaping European society in the process. In southern France, the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, turned the machinery of holy war against Christian heretics for the first time. The Cathars, who rejected the material world as evil and followed an ascetic dualist theology, found themselves declared enemies of Christendom. When the papal forces captured the city of Béziers, the papal legate allegedly replied to a question about distinguishing heretics from faithful Catholics. "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether apocryphal or not, this sentiment reflected the crusading mentality now directed inward. Meanwhile, along Europe's northeastern frontier, the Northern Crusades brought Christianity to the Baltic by sword rather than sermon. The Teutonic Knights established a crusader state along the Baltic coast, forcibly converting pagan peoples and fundamentally altering the region's ethnic, religious, and political landscape. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule, was reimagined as a crusade after Urban II's call. What had been a complex struggle involving political alliances that sometimes crossed religious lines became increasingly framed as a sacred mission. These alternative crusades reveal how the concept evolved beyond its original context. Crusading became a flexible template that could be applied to any perceived threat to Christendom, whether external or internal. This underlying psychology remained remarkably consistent. The identification of an other, the sanctification of violence, and the promise of spiritual rewards for participation. From holy warriors to heretics. The Knights Templar emerged as the exemplars of the Crusades, combining martial prowess with monastic discipline. These warrior monks amassed considerable power and wealth, setting up early banking systems and becoming influential players in both religious and political spheres, yet their very success made them vulnerable. By the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France had accumulated substantial debt with the Templars. His solution? Accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and elaborate secret rituals. Under torture, confessions were virtually guaranteed. While these admissions were almost certainly false, the damage was done. The Church, eager to maintain the balance of power, dissolved the order in 1312, and many Templars were burned at the stake. The fall of the Templars signalled the growing tension between religious institutions and the rising tide of skepticism. Their downfall symbolised how easily faith could be twisted to serve political agendas. The psychological fallout. The Crusades left deep psychological scars that shaped Europe's relationship with religion for centuries to come. What made this trauma particularly profound was its religious justification. How could one reconcile the horror of war with the belief that it fulfilled God's will? The moral disillusionment proved devastating. When news of Constantinople's sack reached Europe, it created a profound crisis of faith. You return from Sunday Mass to hear that Christian knights have plundered the greatest Christian city in the world, slaughtering fellow believers while carrying crosses on their shields. How could this be God's will? If holy warriors could commit such acts against fellow Christians, what did that say about the Church leading them? This disillusionment planted seeds of skepticism towards religious authority. While the Crusades didn't directly cause the Reformation, they undermined the Church's claims to moral infallibility. The spectacle of spiritual leaders blessing massacres led people to question whether the Church's authority truly derived from divine sources or merely served as a tool for control. As institutional religion's credibility diminished, people began seeking spiritual fulfillment elsewhere. A new kind of spiritual exploration gradually emerged, more personal, more individual, less dependent on the Church's mediation. The Crusades had inadvertently opened the door to new understandings of faith that relied less exclusively on religious authority. Bridges amid battlefields. Despite the violence and division, the Crusades paradoxically became one of history's great catalysts for cultural and intellectual exchange. As Europe's established kingdoms in the Near East, they encountered a sophisticated Islamic civilization that in many ways surpassed their own. Medical knowledge represented perhaps the most immediate benefit. European physicians encountered the medical texts of Ibn Sina and Al-Razi, whose systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment far exceeded contemporary Western practices. Crusader hospitals began adopting Islamic medical techniques, leading to the first European medical schools that explicitly drew on Arabic sources. Even everyday life changed. Europeans gained exposure to new textiles, foodstuffs, and hygiene practices. Returning Crusaders introduced sugar, citrus fruits, rice, and spices, and transformed European cuisine. This exchange, already in motion before the Crusades, accelerated in their wake, reshaping European science, architecture, and intellectual life. This paradoxical relationship, simultaneous conflict and collaboration, reminds us that human connections often transcend the boundaries drawn by religious and political authorities. When faith has no shield. The Crusades had exposed the Church's willingness to use faith as a weapon of war, creating the first significant cracks in its moral authority. But an even greater challenge to religious certainty approached, one that no amount of military might or theological arguments could overcome. As the 14th century unfolded, Europe would face a more devastating enemy than any army, a microscopic plague that would kill millions and shake the foundations of faith more profoundly than a holy war ever could. While the Church struggled to explain the moral complexities of the Crusades, it would soon face questions it couldn't begin to answer. Why would a loving God allow such indiscriminate suffering? What happens when prayers go unanswered? And what becomes of faith when its institutions prove powerless against invisible enemies? The psychological impact of the Crusades, the disillusionment, the questioning of authority, the search for meaning beyond institutional religion had planted seeds of doubt. The Black Death would make those seeds burst into full bloom, accelerating the transformation of European consciousness in ways that would permanently reshape how humanity understood faith, knowledge, and its own place in a fragile and unpredictable world. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.